The UN wants to run every area of life under various pretexts, pursuing security, pursuing sustainability, pursuing efficiency, and things like this. It's a huge power grab, a power grab of epic proportions, agreed to, at least without objection, by every government in the world.
This is Kaiser Johnson with Liberty and Finance, and these are the Miles Franklin Weekly Specials for October 21st through October 28th, 2024, while supplies last. This week we feature gold half-ounce backdated Canadian maples at just $110 over melt. We also have backdated silver 1-ounce Britannia at just $2.99 over spot per ounce. To order our specials or any of the many other options we have available, call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237. We're available after hours and on weekends, and we look forward to speaking with you.
Welcome back to Liberty and Finance. We're always delighted to have this returning guest, Alex Newman, a contributor at Epoch Times, also at the Liberty Sentinel, and several other authors and speaking and of many different places, upstanding for people's rights, for families, and for freedom in the face of both federal and global overreach. Alex, thank you for joining us this Wednesday, October 23rd, 2024.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me, Dunnigan.
You just returned recently from a interestingly named UN Summit of the Future. You've warned us about that prior to it. You gave us a rundown of what you expected you might hear there. We wanted to get a brain dump from you on the key takeaways that you found at that summit and what future it is planning for us, these elites, and what we need to do to be aware, prepared, and to prepare to survive and thrive in the future, despite perhaps these nefarious plans that are being laid for us. So what did you learn there and your key takeaways?
Well, thanks, Dunnigan. The real big takeaway is that the UN is now coming out of the closet on an agenda that has been there for 80 years, and that is global governance. They are moving away. You know, when the UN was first created, the ostensible purpose was to maintain the peace, right? If they had said, hey, we want to run your education system, and we want to tell you, about what you can do with the environment, and we want to manage the economy for you, people would have laughed at these people. They would have been laughed out of the room, and that would have been the end of that. They said, oh, we're just going to be a venue for governments to be able to talk about their differences so they don't have to go to war. Well, the pretense is now being completely dropped. And as the UN puts it itself, we're now moving toward UN 2.0, where every area of life, every area of government will fall under UN jurisdiction. And I encourage people to read this document themselves. It is not that long. You could read it in a few hours at most. It's 60 plus pages. They tacked on 2 additional agreements to the Pact for the Future, the final outcome document. But it boils down to this. The UN wants to run every area of life under various pretexts, pursuing security, pursuing sustainability, pursuing efficiency, and things like this. And they make this very, very clear in the document. They want to grant vastly more power to the UN itself as an organization, and also in particular to the UN Secretary General, who has a mandate under this Pact for the Future to handle global emergencies, as declared, of course, by him. And so it's a huge power grab, a power grab of epic proportions, agreed to, at least without objection, by every government in the world. This pact was passed by what they call consensus. And so it's a big deal. And I think people make a mistake, Dunnigan, of assuming that it's not important because they didn't hear anything about it on the media. You know, even Fox News is not talking about this, so it must not be important. No, it's extremely important. As the UN itself was saying, all over the summit, they had these pictures of this quote by Secretary General Antonio Guterres, where they pulled it out and put it in a big speech bubble. It says, we can't build a future for our grandchildren with a system built for our grandparents. And so that's really the idea here is we've got to have the UN completely reformed to bring about global governance. And that's what they're moving toward very quickly.
It's terrifying in ways because we've seen how this plays out before. First of all, in the most recent history, over the past 4 years, the entire population of the globe was subject to mandates and guidelines that came from some mysterious, unelected, unaccountable bodies. How many of us tried to go to places of business, tried to go to either our own job or to stores or to other venues or to travel, et cetera, and we're told in compliance with guidelines offered by the blah, blah, blah. And usually you chase those up, and it became that those guidelines were coming from global entities, which we had absolutely no influence over. So it's a complete abdication of individual and local and state and even federal accountability and responsibility to this nebulous global leadership. And another thing, we've interviewed constitutional attorneys on this, and they've said there is the word emergency, as you mentioned, emergency powers, emergency measures, that sort of thing. The word emergency does not appear in the U.S. Constitution. So there's absolutely no constitutional basis for granting emergency powers to anyone, even inside the U.S., let alone outside the U.S. And then when it's the self-declared emergency powers that seem to be without control, without limit, that sort of thing. Just last night, happened to see on Turner Classic Movies, the movie Cleopatra. If you haven't seen it, you might want to take a look, because Julius Caesar becoming the dictator of Rome for life and having extraordinary powers and all this sort of thing. We've run this playbook before. It doesn't end well for the average person. Now, you've studied the UN. You followed it for some time. You've studied a lot of these extraordinary measures that have been imposed on people. But you remain rather upbeat about what we can do and must do at the individual level, individual, family, community, state, county, and federal to resist and to reject these immoral mandates on our freedoms. Any specific examples that you think people need to be specifically aware of that are likely to come our way, and what they can do to resist and reject those?
Well, we're seeing unprecedented resistance to the UN and its agenda. Before we even get into that, to pick back up on what you were describing with the emergency powers and the different things that the UN is going for. I want people to remember what happened during COVID, where the World Health Organization was issuing recommendations and governments around the world were implementing those quote-unquote recommendations. People like the ones who run YouTube were deciding what could or could not be said, what could or could not be heard on their platform based on World Health Organization. That's according to the now dead CEO of YouTube, Susan Wojcicki. Anything that goes against WHO recommendations, we're going to remove. So imagine that kind of idea where an undemocratic, unelected bureaucrat at some international organization, likely put in there with help from the most murderous dictatorship in human history, the CCP, will make your decisions for you across all different sectors, not just public health now. We're talking about environment, we're talking about economy, we're talking every single area. So when people think of the UN, they need to realize now there are institutions within the UN that parallel institutions at the national level. So we have an EPA. The UN has a UN Environment Program. We have a Department of Health and Human Services. The UN has a World Health Organization. We have a Patent Office. The UN has a World Intellectual Property Organization. We have a Department of Education. The UN has a UNESCO, UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. So every one of the areas that people traditionally associate with governance now, the power and authority is being shifted to the international level with the deliberate surrender of sovereignty by national governments. And that's happening in a variety of different ways. There was actually an amendment proposed to this document. I think they're trying to set a narrative here by the Kremlin. And so the Kremlin says, hey, nothing in this pact, they proposed an amendment that said nothing in this pact may be construed to allow the UN to interfere in matters that are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of a nation state. And 6 other governments voted in favor of that amendment, all vile, nasty dictatorships in North Korea, Syria, Iran, Nicaragua, you name it. And the other governments, 140 plus governments, voted it down. Why would you vote that down, right? We're being told that the UN is not infringing on our sovereignty. So this is a power grab of historic proportions that it just applies across all areas of life. And so what can we do and what is happening in terms of resistance? Well, very, very significant things. So the first point I want to mention here, and you have to forgive me, I slept very few hours last night. I was at Mar-a-Lago, and so my brain is on half speed today. But they actually, about half of the nation's governors came out and released a public statement saying they were not going to obey World Health Organization recommendations, decrees, or mandates. This is a very public letter. They sent it to Joe Biden as well. And they said, look, the federal government doesn't have authority to tell us what to do on healthcare. We're certainly not going to be allowing the UN, the World Health Organization, to make those decisions for us. This is a constitutional issue. We are not allowing that. And so I would encourage those same governors to think about that issue in the same terms when it comes to the environment, when it comes to the economy, when it comes to energy, when it comes to all these different areas. The states just need to say no. And we're moving very quickly in that direction. We've had multiple states now pass laws saying they're not going to comply with UN agendas, and that's very, very encouraging. I'll be going to Azerbaijan in just a few weeks here for the COP29, and they're going to be proposing all kinds of sovereignty-destroying, energy grid-destroying measures. And so we need these state governors to lead the way and say, no, we're not going to accept that. At the same time, we've got a lot of local governments doing the same thing. Here in Florida, we've got multiple counties that have declared themselves to be constitutional sanctuaries, where no policies from the federal, state, or the international level that infringe on the U.S. Constitution, in particular the 10th Amendment, which reserves all the powers not delegated to the U.S. government to the states or the people. We're not going to be allowing those to be enforced in our counties. And so that's a very, very encouraging measure that we're seeing more and more state and local governments resisting. We're also seeing action in Congress. For the first time ever, Dunnigan, we've got bills in both houses of Congress, one in the House, one in the Senate. It's called the Defund Act, and actually the name defund is a little bit misleading because this does much more than defund the United Nations. It actually withdraws from the UN. We would terminate our relationship with this international organization. And of course, we know Joe Biden is not going to sign that. But the fact that we have a bill in both houses of Congress that is broadly supported by mainstream Republican leaders going into an election where it looks like the Republican Party is going to dominate, we have a very, very serious opportunity here in 2025 for federal resistance. And that may take the form of defunding all this stuff. It may go further. Right? During the last Trump administration, we saw him get out of the WHO, the UNESCO, the UNRWA, the UN Human Rights Council, the Paris Agreement, the UN Compact on Migration. It slapped sanctions on the International Criminal Court. By the way, the UN Pact for the Future says all nations must submit to the decrees of the International Court of Justice. So lots going on in terms of resistance. I've never seen anything like this. It's becoming very, very mainstream. And I can tell you from being at these things, the globalists are very concerned about this American opposition. They know that without our money, we pay about a third of the budget, the whole house of cards comes crashing down.
One thing you mentioned along the way is that a lot of these issues that are areas of intrusion into the privacy and freedom of individual lives and of both individuals and countries are grouped into the lasso of public health. They say climate is part of public health. Agriculture, what animals you can raise and eat are part of public health because that affects the climate and that affects public health. They say energy, what kind of energy you can consume or use or produce or whatever is part of health because it feeds into the climate issue. They say because of public health and the potential for epidemics, and they say, trust us, there's a worse one coming, which is what they told us the last time before the worst one came, is contact tracing and lockdowns and having to submit mandatory to experimental medical treatments that are not what they are called, neither safe nor effective, et cetera. And even the right to bear arms. All of these are under the umbrella of public health. Any comments from you on how you can throw a wide enough net over our lives that you can call just everything under the jurisdiction of someone who has really no rights whatsoever over our lives?
Well, what you just described is exactly what's happening, Dunnigan. And I've been to these UN meetings where the head of the WHO, Director General Tedros Ghebreyesus, who, by the way, in his prior life was actually a leader of an ethno-Marxist terrorist organization, so designated by multiple Western governments, by the way. It was called the Tigray People's Liberation Front, not just a Marxist terror group, an ethno-Marxist terror group. They hated particular groups of people, especially the Amhara, and tried to eliminate them off the face of the planet. So these are vile, vile people. And this guy's running around all over the world saying, it's not just enough to control everything under the guise of public health. Now we got to expand our understanding of public health. Racism is a public health crisis. I heard him at the climate summit in Egypt saying climate change is a public health crisis. And of course, if climate change is a public health crisis, then under the guise of public health, we have to restrict CO2 emissions. And under the guise of restricting CO2 emissions, every aspect of your life would come under global regulation. I mean, literally, you exhale CO2, about 2 pounds of it every day, just so people get an understanding of how significant these claims are. They claim that gun violence is a public health issue, which means, of course, they need authority to regulate our ability to own and use firearms. So this is an all-encompassing agenda. And you see it in the emergency protocol as well. If you read Action Item 54 in the Pact for the Future, it describes this basically a mandate for the Secretary General to take all power and authority during any kind of global emergency. And to fully understand and appreciate what all that means, you have to go back to the policy brief that informed that Action Item 54. And that was released by Secretary General Guterres in early 2023. I did a major article about it. And what it says essentially is that when the Secretary General determines there's an emergency, and it could be about climate, environment, economy, war, it could be a black swan event that we can't even predict. It doesn't have to be global. It might be something in space. We don't even know. When the Secretary General, former socialist leader of the Socialist International, determines that there's an emergency, says all stakeholders, all the nations, businesses, entities, nonprofit organizations, all must recognize it as the primary decision-making authority of the multilateral organizations. In other words, we're all going to be taking our cues from the UN. So this is an all-encompassing agenda that deals with every area of your life. And this is very, very clear in all the UN documents about it. There's nothing that escapes the purview of the control that they're trying to build here. And again, all you have to do is read their documents to see where they're going with this. They will tell you if you will just read their documents.
It's not unusual, but it's chilling. Again, if you try to do a standard internet search on this topic, UN Summit of the Future, especially if you ask a question in there such as like global takeover or imposing mandates, something, the first several pages of results you'll get are all saying, don't worry, it doesn't impose mandates, it doesn't take away the sovereignty of your country, it's all voluntary on the part of the countries, they all have to opt in, It's all pacifying and placating type stories and articles that come up first. You have to really dig down to find ones that say what you have said, and that is that the actual wording of the document says you will be subject to these things. Any thoughts from you on how difficult it is for ordinary people to get the straight story on this?
This is by design, Dunnigan, and it's one of the areas that we explored while we were there. So Melissa Fleming, she's the UN Undersecretary General for Communications. She is basically the person at the UN in charge of global communications, really global propaganda. And I have some sources in her office. She does not like me at all. That's okay. So I got some of the memos that we're putting out to all the communications executives saying, this is a huge deal. We all got to focus. We all got to stay on message. So she announced in 2022 at the World Economic Forum at a sustainability event that they had a partnership with Google to basically control information. And she used the example of climate change. She said, we first became alarmed when we Googled climate change and figured out that there was lots of inaccurate information. And of course, she was thinking of my articles, the things we put out for years and years. That was at the top of Google. You could type in 2030 Agenda 2030, Sustainable Development Goals. My article was the top one, my article in the New American Magazine, because that was the one that had the most readers, the most things linking back to it. So she was appalled by that. She did not like that, as she explained to the World Economic Forum. So they created a partnership, as she described it, with Google to make sure that when you Google climate change or sustainable development or pact for the future, you're going to get UN propaganda instead of critical journalism, actual journalism on these topics. And again, they're very transparent about this fact. Anybody can watch that video. We showed it. She announced this publicly, that they had a partnership with Google. And so I went up to her at the Summit of the Future. We ran into her after a Freedom of the Press event. Very ironic. And as a member of the press, I went up to her and said, hey, Melissa, Alex Newman with the New American Magazine, would you be kind enough to please tell us about the details of this partnership? What information is going to appear there? And what's the formula you guys use? I mean, how do you determine what should be allowed? What should not be allowed? What should be buried? What should be promoted? She said, we own the science when she announced this partnership. So, how do you determine whether my claims about climate are in keeping with your ownership of the alleged science? And her response was very, very telling. She thought about it for a minute. Who are you? I don't recognize you. I can't talk to you. Runs away, scatters away. And her staff then swoops in and, she doesn't have time to talk to you. Just give us your business card. We'll set up an appointment later. Sure. And right behind me, my cameraman is filming all of this. Right behind me, she's talking to other journalists. So she had plenty of time to talk to people, just no time to answer serious questions about why Google and the United Nations are now rigging the algorithm to determine what you can see on all these critical questions that impact your life. You want to talk about election interference? This is the ultimate election interference. Having an unelected, unaccountable organization dominated by tyrants, founded by tyrants and mass murderers, determining what you can and can't see as you're trying to inform yourself on the issues of the day. And then not even being willing to talk about it, not even being willing to explain how these decisions are made. This is unconscionable. I mean, this is the stuff that you would expect to see in North Korea or Iran, not in a civilized, free country. And yet we're paying for it all as American taxpayers.
And I would add to that list of places you'd expect to see this is in the book 1984 by George Orwell, where the existence of truth about the present or the past is under the control of the party and Big Brother. In this case, as you mentioned, she says, we own the science, and we've certainly heard the term the science. It's been interesting because several well-respected scientists have come out and said anyone who uses the term the science should be treated with skepticism, because the fundamental premise of the scientific method is that you can question all postulates and theories, and you test them with observation, and you debate them, and you try to come to an understanding of truth by opening the book of nature. Even as Galileo said, the book of nature is open to all who would read it. So rather than someone saying, I will be the official interpreter, and you come to me when you want to know the official answer, and I'll tell you what to think. The same problem occurs to us when we try to search out answers to many different things, whether it's about our financial lives or about our food supply. You've talked to us about those issues in the past as well. In an area of resistance, how can people who are sincerely truth seekers and trying to inform themselves and their neighbors, friends, family, coworkers, etc., make headway in this era where the official sources are, you would say, curated to provide a certain narrative that almost invariably removes our freedoms, removes our ability to take action, meaningful action in our own lives, and to govern our own lives?
Well, it's a great question, Dunnigan. And I would say for the first item, stop trusting the media and start doing your own research. And, CNN and the rest of the clown car fake news will tell you that, you don't want to do your own research. That's the stuff of conspiracy. No, just read these documents yourself, right? Don't rely on me to interpret them for you. Don't rely on Dunnigan to interpret them for you. Don't rely on the UN or the fake media to interpret them for you. Just read them, right? The Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Agenda, they call it the Master Plan for Humanity. It's referenced well over 100 times in the Pact for the Future. Just go read the thing. Right? Anybody can go read this. They've got 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and they will give you a very clear vision of the world through their lens, right? So goal number 10, for example, you got to have wealth redistribution, not just at the national level anymore, but at the international level. It says that governments essentially need to take control of the means of production. They need to make fundamental changes, it says, in the way goods and services are consumed and produced. Goal number 4 tells you that all your kids are going to be brainwashed, so brainwashed that they will actively promote this ideology of sustainable development. And all this stuff is stuff that people can verify for themselves. When you're done listening to us here, go look up 2030 Agenda Sustainable Development, read it right on the UN's website, and look past the window dressing. We're going to solve world hunger. We're going to solve poverty, and just read what they're asking for. They're asking for a blank check on our money, on our freedom, on our sovereignty to supposedly solve these real and imagined problems. Go read the Pact for the Future. They tell you in very clear terms that they want the UN to expand into every area of life and that we all must submit to their views. So that's, I think, the easiest way to get the facts about this stuff done. Again, it's just don't believe what you're reading. Don't believe what you're seeing. Turn off the TV and go read these documents yourself. Of course, it's great to tune into programs like yours to know what is going on in the world. I would encourage people to really spend some time on this, especially now that you know that Google is trying to manipulate you and what you hear about politics, about science, about climate, about health. Now that you know that censorship is running rampant, and in fact, that's a major part of the Pact for the Future. Over and over again, they talk about information integrity. Governments and the UN must wage war on misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. Since when have we needed censorship to promote truth, right? The people doing the censoring are always the ones lying to you. And I can't think of any example throughout history where the people doing the censoring were the ones telling you the truth. Truth doesn't need censorship to support it. People will be able to determine for themselves what is true. So you really don't need that unless you're trying to manipulate people. So simple advice, educate yourself, read the documents for yourself, and stop using Google and other big tech companies that are, at this point, very publicly trying to manipulate you and very publicly doing so in cooperation with the United Nations and other governments.
I mentioned in the beginning that you're a contributor at Epoch Times. We have a paper subscription to the print edition of the Epoch Times, and find that has a consistent bias towards individual freedom, liberty, transparency, that sort of thing. Are there, in addition to that, other sources that you recommend that people, in addition to reading source documents, which is obviously, getting closer to the horse's mouth is the best thing. Many people find that overwhelming or daunting, and it's helpful to know that there are voices that hear there. I've even, as you said, when you read that document, it sounds lovely. It's covered with these words that sound like virtuous things. It's just virtue after virtue after virtue until you go, wait a minute, like everything else that's come out of government or officialdom over the last several decades, it seems like it's named the exact opposite of what it actually does. Any other sources in addition to, for example, the Epoch Times that you can suggest to people might help them as a kind of like a Davy Crockett through the mountains to help them find their way to understanding and translating some of these documents into human speak?
Yeah, well, I appreciate it, Dunnigan. Thank you. And there's a lot of sources I will recommend. And I will point out even before I get there, what you said is so important for people to understand. No dictator, no tyrant has ever said, hey, I'm going to enslave you. And if you disagree, I'm going to kill you, right? That's not what they do. They say, oh, I'm going to help you. I love you. I'm going to feed you. I'm going to solve your problems for you. So combining primary source documents with a decent understanding of history and how governments operate will give you a clear understanding of what's going on in the world. One place people can go, they can get my newsletter for free. It's at libertysentinel.org. Sentinel is SENTINEL.org. We put that out twice a week for free. Also, I'm senior editor at the New American Magazine. We actually do, in addition to all the work we do online, we do a print magazine because Google and the government, et cetera, they can't silence this yet. So we encourage people to get that. Those are some very good sources. And of course, your excellent program, Liberty and Finance, is a good place for people to find accurate information on critical issues that affect their health, their freedom, their prosperity, their economy, et cetera. So just find a lot of different sources, compare them with primary source documents, factor in a decent understanding of the historical record, and you'll come to a much better understanding of what's going on in the world than you would from endless watching of the boob tube, as it's called, or even reading the fake media.
Well, Alex, we're always grateful for your visits here. I know you had to work us in this time just after Hurricane Milton took out your power for several days. Grateful for being here with us on Liberty and Finance. All of our viewers and subscribers appreciate your visits here. And just thank you for this visit. We're going to have you back on soon because it seems that there's an acceleration of these type of developments. And so we need to make sure that we're getting the information to people so that they have time to prepare and to respond and to make sure that they're standing up for themselves, their families, their communities, and their countries. And just thank you for joining us on Liberty and Finance.
Thank you for having me, Dunnigan. Always a pleasure.
This is Kaiser Johnson with Liberty and Finance, and these are the Miles Franklin Weekly Specials for October 21st through October 28th, 2024, while supplies last. This week we feature gold half-ounce backdated Canadian maples at just $110 over melt. We also have backdated silver 1-ounce Britannia at just $2.99 over spot per ounce. To order our specials or any of the many other options we have available, call us at 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237. We're available after hours and on weekends, and we look forward to speaking with you.